So how do movements frame their causes to create collective identities and build alliance? Number one, I think a lot of these movements understand the experiences of different actors and they are trying to highlight them. For example, um, usually an environmental hazard has multiple impacts. For example, a commercial plantation project can cause workers' health issue, can cause pollutions, and also affect the property prices. So, and this environmental impact can actually be experienced through locally relevant identities. So, the different social positions of gender, race, and caste. For example, I think I have mentioned this before, deforestation has disproportionate impact on women's workload and income because women have to collect fodders and firewood, and they kind of collect some non-forest timber products for additional income. So, by looking at how environment is experienced by different actors, these movements sometimes are able to highlight a particular group that they want to focus on. For example, Chipko has been widely propagated as a women's movement, and this appeals to feminists, especially eco-feminists. So you can look up eco-feminists, but very briefly, eco-feminists are a group of people thinking that the exploitations of women and the exploitation of nature are integrated with each other. So they are called the eco-feminists. So Chipko is widely propagated as an eco-feminist movement. And of course, this broaden the support base, especially among women or among feminists. And then Narmada anti-dam goes beyond asking for compensation to oppose dam construction entirely. And this actually appeals to scientists and environmentalists because in the beginning, the movement was just considering about asking for just compensations to people who are going to be displaced. But then when they realized that maybe this will never happen, maybe people will never be compensated justly, so they opposed the dam construction entirely. And then these also appeal to not just people who are going to be displaced, they appeal to scientists and environmentalists. So it is building an intellectual support base. And then also we read about in our reading, Zapatista actually work on women's concerns such as alcoholism. And then the second way is they are really trying to empower Indigenous way of knowing. Traditionally, when you look at the usual decision-making process at the national or local level by the government, you can see that the local people and industry people will use very different languages in their negotiations, right? So industry will say that, oh, how much income I will bring to this place, how much tax I will pay, and how much employment that I will provide. And then the local people will tell you that, oh, if this project really comes, my children will be poisoned, or I see dead fish in our stream, I think our water quality is compromised. So the industry will use statistics and numbers to influence decision making, but the local people can only tell sort of anecdote of their experiences. So and they are being valued differently, unfortunately, right? And then so there is an incommensurability as well, and unequal power between different knowledge systems, such as when you talk to Aboriginal people in Alaska, they don't have the words such as subsistence and conservation. So these are different, very alien concepts to them. So you can not really talk using these languages or negotiate using these languages with them. What happens in the end is because of this incommensurability of different understanding of different knowledge system, usually the indigenous way of knowing tend to be ignored with the governments or the experts favoring the languages that they are used to and the way of looking at the world that they are used to. So social movements really try to empower indigenous way of knowing. For example, the Standing Rock movement in the US, it is very famous. I'm sure you have heard of it. and the Penang people in Borneo, Malaysia, they really talk about the sacredness of the landscape. Why is it important? It's not important just because it is affecting our health and our livelihood, but because the landscape is sacred for us, it is our homeland. So this is already a different way of knowing compared to the mainstream understanding of environment as being something to be used, right? And then Ogoni movement appeals to underrepresented nations and people organizations. Let me double check that. So Ogoni movement is the movement in Niger Delta that I asked you to read about a week ago on environmental injustice. So the Ogoni movement appeals to indigenous group to talk about indigenous sovereignty in their case. So, and then we have self-government by indigenous under Zapatista, which protect trees and animals. So I include a quote here: "The land is sacred. It belongs to the countless numbers who are dead, the few who are living, and the multitude of those yet to be born." And the third way of building collective identities and framing the movements is to recognize historical marginalizations. So many of these movements actually are deeply aware that some of these inequalities or injustice problems are directly related to historical oppression and historical marginalization. So historical marginalization of race, caste, and class lead to poverty and living in marginal land. For example, environmental apartheid in South Africa that we have talked about. And untouchable castes, the elites in South Asia are historically not allowed to access common water resources, and we have also talked about this. So you see the convergence between environmental racism movement and civil rights movements because it is directly related to racial inequality. And then you also see contemporary India, there is actually some base collective actions and the elite rights in India that join together to ask for rights, civil rights. I have taken out one quote from the article by Marcos that I asked you to read because death does not hurt. What hurts is to be forgotten. So the Zapatista movement is also a result of centuries of neglect and marginalization of indigenous people. And the last one here is movements connect to wider institutions, especially today with globalizations. These movements will appeal to global arena for contentions, make connections to global institutions such as the World Bank. For example, the anti-Narmada Dam movement in India appeals to the World Bank to stop funding the dam project, leading to the World Commission on Dam. So many of the developing countries nowadays have the infrastructure project being funded by multilateral organizations such as the World Bank or IMF or Asian Development Bank, etc. So some of these social movements target this multilateral institution to stop funding to the government, and it has worked to a certain extent. For example, Rubber Tappers movement in Brazil also appealed to the US Congress, the World Bank, and Inter-American Development Bank, which fund road projects in the region. And so usually movements work with allies from the global north to access this platform. So usually it's international NGOs representative from the global north came and connect with these local movements and local movement leaders, brought their leaders to the northern governments, the US government, the European governments to plead their case. And then this government will then pressure these World Bank institutions or the other multilateral institution to actually reconsider funding these different projects. So, for example, Shinko Mendes is the leader of the Rubber Tappers movement in Brazil, and you can check it out. He's a very famous figure, but he has been assassinated. So the Rubber Tappers movement is essentially like what he said. At first, I thought I was fighting to save rubber trees. Then I thought I was fighting to save the Amazon rainforest. Now I realize I'm fighting for humanity. So the rubber trees have been cut down by ranchers who are going to appropriate those land for their grazing livestock. So the peasants who were dependent on rubber trees in the forest were kind of deprived of their livelihood, so they have formed a union to fight against this deforestation. And then when they reach out to international NGOs, the framing from fighting for their livelihoods became a framing to save the Amazon rainforest. So it became an environmentalist framing. Then it further evolved into a justice framing, right? So this, you can see that this quote is actually a process of framing alignment. You can say that, right? Aligning the original cause or concern of the local to the wider concerns of the humanity. So, and previously I was talking a little bit about the boomerang effect, and you can see that a lot of global South movements have been successful based on this effect. So what is the boomerang effect? So if you can see here, state A and state B. So state A, for example, let's say is a developing country that have a local conflict in terms of environment. So there are local NGOs or local movement, local people working on this conflict. And then they reach out and connect to international NGO from usually more powerful countries in the global north. So they give them information and connect to them. And then these NGOs will advocate on their behalf. Especially they will pressure their own government, state B, their own government, who will then pressure back the original governments, who are usually the weaker government in terms of economy and global power relations. And also sometimes these governments of richer countries will actually pressure through intergovernmental organizations like the UN or the World Bank, because they are essentially the main powerful actors of organizations like the World Bank, so they can influence the decisions of intergovernmental organizations that will then pressure developing countries, such as actually the Namada anti-dam movement is working exactly through this model. So was the rubber tappers movement. The Namada anti-dam movement have the Indian movements connecting with international movements that brought the leader of the anti-Namada movement to present in front of governments of the northern states, which then pressure World Bank not to fund the project. However, I have a bad news for you. So even though World Bank stopped funding the Namada Dam, India is still resourceful enough to carry on with the Namada Dam. So I think the Namada Dam has already been completed very recently. So this is what we call the boomerang effect. Which is actually one of the very important strategies of many movements in the global south. Of course, apart from what I have told you so far, number one, to understand the experience of different local actors, and then number two, empowering indigenous way of knowing, number three, understanding historical marginalization, and number four, connect to wider institutions. So there are also other factors such as strong local movements and collective identities. So many of the successful movements actually have to have really strong grassroots-based support, and usually they already have some sort of collective identities, such as among the Zapatista, it is the Indigenous group, and then among the rubber tappers movement, it is the rubber tappers unions, and then we also have the ethnicities such as the Ogoni people joining together to ask for their Ogoni rights, and then such as the Chico movement is based on a village-based relationship, so people who work together in those movements already had established relationships or share identities. And then Northern allies are really, really important, and many of them will actually pressure their own governments to stop harmful projects in the other countries. And then also all these movements also share a characteristic of charismatic movement leaders, such as Marcos, who's writing Our Word is Our Weapon, who's writing I Ask You to Read. He's the sort of spokesperson of Zapatista. Oh, actually, he stepped down already, but he was the spokesperson of the Zapatista for a long time, and he's really a charismatic person. He's very good in using words, and so was Shinko Mendez, who was assassinated as a movement leader among the rappers, and then also framing alignments. The example that I had just given you a while ago is Shinko Mendez, how he reframed his original movement about fighting for his livelihood of rubber trees to fighting for Amazon rainforest to fighting for humanity. So all these other factors are also very important to support movement success. So my question is, do you think there is a difference of social movement causes and strategy in the global south and north? Can they learn from each other? So maybe one way to further talk about this question is, if you are from the global north, how would you support the global south movement? Or if you are from the global south, how would you reach out to global north movement partners in order to gain their support? So I think these are questions worth pondering, especially if you are interested in helping in social movements to address poverty and justice. Thank you very much for listening to the lecture. So this is the final slides of this class, and I just want to thank all of you for listening patiently to all of these different lectures, and I hope you have learned at least something from this class. I really enjoy teaching this class and reading all your discussions in the online forums and also in the synchronous sections. I appreciate your engagement. This is the biggest reward an instructor will get. This is a short 6 week. I didn't get to know a lot of you better, but I do hope you feel free to reach out to me when you need to.